Alrighty. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about operationalizing ESG for sustainability and success. Joining us today is we have Marc Campbell, the Manager of Sustainability Policy and Programs at SRP, and Boudewijn Neijens, CMO of Copperleaf. Before we get into it, we're really going to be talking about how pursuing environmental, social, governance initiatives adds complexity to investment planning and decision making by introducing additional criteria to be considered. And in order to meet targets related to net zero, grid modernization, climate resilience, and other pressing sustainability challenges, utilities need to be able to assess the impacts of these factors directly in their decision-making process in a quantifiable way. Marc, Boudewijn, how are you guys doing today?
Fantastic, thank you.
Doing great. Although it's the first cold day of the season here in Vancouver, I woke up with 10 degrees Celsius, which is not much.
No, that sounds quite chilly, but what a nice change. Are you ready for the new season?
You're never ready for the new season, but we'll do with it.
Fair enough. What about you, Marc?
We're still 105 here in Phoenix, so I'm ready for the change of seasons. Maybe in another month or so.
I was going to say, do you get a change of seasons?
We do. We really only have 2 seasons, I think, hot and hotter, but actually winter is quite nice. We do get some cool down. End of October through about March or so really becomes quite lovely. So looking forward to that.
Awesome. Well, I mean, definitely still like weather is really relevant to the conversation that we're having today, and I'm eager to get started. Are you guys ready?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, so with the push to net zero and other grid modernization initiatives, ESG can be such a nebulous concept for those wanting to pursue sustainability. Can you better define the term and what it means to you? Boudewijn, you want to start us off?
Yep, and actually, let me just share my screen because I think in this particular case, a little diagram might help us just to get a focus on the topic. So this is my definition, and I say my definition because there is no official definition of ESG. I've been looking, and everybody seems to make it up as they go. So that's what I did. What I tried here was try to compress the topics that you most frequently hear or see if you're comparing notes, from different experts on the subject. So obviously ESG is environmental, social, and governance. Everybody agrees on that. But then what falls under those 3 different topics? There's definitely plus and minus lists there as to what's in, what's out. So this is a pretty good list. This is kind of the consensus view, if you wish. So on the environmental side, as you can see, no big surprises. Obviously, pollution, which has been with us for a long time. Climate change, which is very much in line with what you were saying, Joyce. But also, of course, water use, land use, waste, etc. And I colored in a darker color all the ones that I see as being directly affected or potentially directly affected by the way that we manage our organizations on the asset and operations side versus other stuff which might be a bit softer, like diversity or executive remuneration, which are things which we really don't have much influence over as operations and asset management people. On the society side, obviously, the big ones are health and safety. Have a big influence on that, working conditions, but also local communities. We can definitely influence that. And then on the governance side, obviously risk management is the big one for us. I'm sure we'll talk about that later. And to some extent, tax strategy, just because when we look at all the assets that we buy and we operate, obviously depreciation of those assets has a massive impact on tax strategy, and therefore your strategy on what to do when might actually be influenced by tax. But that's very simplistically the way that I kind of break it out. And then you talked about grid modernization as one of the components thereof. And I tried, therefore, to kind of build up a little model as to how do you go from ESG, which is this very broad concept, to something much more tangible like grid modernization. So this is my attempt. Bear with me here. This will take a second. So you have your 3 big headers. And if you look at environment, obviously the key element there that we're talking about right now is climate change. And climate change, again, you can break into 2. That is, first of all, kind of trying to prevent climate change, which would be like your goal to net zero. But at the same time, you also have to kind of combat the effects of climate change, which would be your resilience, right? Hardening the grid, etc. And then, net zero, therefore, you can kind of break out again into, well, there's a couple of ways of doing that. You can do demand reduction, but also you can, of course, kind of engage in the energy transition. So basically kind of shifting away from fossil-based generation, for instance. So that will be the breakdown on environmental. You can do similar things on the societal side and on governance, like for instance, of risk management, you could break it down into, well, all the risks attached to your assets. And then separate of that, you have cybersecurity, which is also a bit headache for many of us. And then if you kind of assemble a couple of those elements, so basically, risk management and cybersecurity, a bit of health and safety, your resilience programs, and your energy transition programs, I'll say it. If you combine those, that's really your grid modernization initiative, right? It's a bit of all those together. And grid mod is, of course, much more tangible in the sense that, there are particular projects that you're going to put in place to deliver on that. And this is kind of trying to make the link, therefore, between the nebulous ESG and the more tangible grid mod. So this is an example of how you could kind of connect the two together. So that was my take on it.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, it definitely applies a lot of really good structure to the conversation. Marc, how do you define this? Nebulous concept?
I think Boudewijn did a nice job of developing that diagram, because I generally agree with that definition. I mean, obviously, I think you pointed out that the elements that we hang beneath each of those pillars can and do vary by organization. And I think, the nebulous nature of ESG poses challenges and opportunities. And frankly, I think sustainability suffers from the perception by non-practitioners of having a bit of an identity crisis in general. And ESG is just really the latest term that adds to that confusion in my mind. And I think we think back, a decade or so ago, we were talking in terms of kind of the standard definition of sustainability, right? And in terms of the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profits, which isn't that dramatically different from ESG. Then we moved on to corporate social responsibility, or CSR. Now that came into vogue. And now ESG is used in a number of different places and really has seemingly become perhaps more popular in Europe. But really, I think although there are some slightly different uses for any of those terms based upon outside perspectives, I think they can all be used somewhat interchangeably. And I'm going to go, I'm going to take this answer in a slightly different direction in just a second. The problem is, I think for us, is that the discipline of sustainability hasn't settled on a universal definition. And that can make it more challenging to firmly establish a deep corporate understanding because of the appearance of building a foundation on sand. You no sooner get decision makers comfortable with the concept and your direction before next thing, another term, an emerging term comes along that describes the same kind of work. And they ask themselves, how is this different from what we're doing? So I'm not sure we're doing ourselves a favor with some of these changing definitions. Very long preamble to answering the specific question, though. So more specifically, I really think of ESG as just another term to describe the concept of people, planet, profits through the specific lens, really, of financial and climate risks. The breadth of sustainability and really the terms that we use is a double-edged sword because it effectively opens up a whole universe of issues for an organization to address. And I get questions, well, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to tackle all of the issues that face society? And so I think what's really more important is defining that corporate scope, because there is an opportunity here really within that breadth. It's so flexible that you can define the material aspects for your organization in creating a sustainability vision. And really at SRP, we have sustainability goals, but we do not call them out as ESG, although there are certainly elements in the diagram that Boudewijn showed us that fit that financial risk definition of ESG. I think what's really more important than the term that we used is how we determine materiality for our organizations and create a definition of our sustainability objectives. We've got to shrink that scope so we know what it is that we're actually trying to accomplish in sustainability. And I think once you get there, you can create a bit of a straight line through those definitional undulations that we're seeing. So really at the end of the day, while it might be time to revisit SRP's overarching definition of sustainability, at SRP, sustainability means, one, proactively addressing our communities and customers' priorities. And I think that's kind of the S part of ESG. Strengthening our management of natural resources, right? Really the E component of it. And this last one isn't so much G, but it certainly ties into it. And that's maintaining our strong commitment to fiscal responsibility while responding to a rapidly changing industry.
Yeah, no, awesome. I mean, I think both of you touched on this, and not having a set definition just like across the board that everybody falls in line with, it does add the complexity, but it also adds a lot of flexibility into how your organization can approach, these initiatives, which is really fantastic. But narrowing that scope is going to be super critical for ultimate success. Very similarly, implementing ESG into the organization, not just defining it, but actually implementing, can seem aspirational at best. But operationalizing ESG or sustainability goals can ensure achievable successes. In what ways have you found this to be true, Marc?
Well, I believe that sustainability has to be embedded into your organization. And the only way to truly do that is by operationalizing sustainability goals. And I think that ties back to the notion that I just touched upon about sustainability's breadth. You've got to make it tangible for people in your organization. If others in the organization can't see sustainability in what they do, I think you're likely to get pushback, because the appearance is that sustainability is additive, right? We're asking people to do more, and they're already busy. I can just imagine some of the responses. As a sustainability manager, I cannot control all of the areas in which our organization needs to be sustainable. But establishing sustainability goals sends a message from the top that sustainability is an important part of corporate strategy, and other groups need to think about that as a matter of doing business every day. It's not additive, but really, I think, a natural part of our corporate fabric. It is what we do. If you look at sustainability, right, it's really what we should all be aspiring to, is to be sustainable organizations and to support our communities. And I think perhaps one of the best things that we did at SRP when we established our 2035 sustainability goals was to identify senior leaders as goal owners and give them the responsibility and the accountability of developing pathways to meet those goals. So my team in the Sustainability Policy and Programs group is responsible for developing and managing the framework and all that comes with that, the workflow, the work processes, behind the scenes systems. But it's really the goal owners that set their own direction and allow their teams to build it from the bottom up. So you're kind of getting this top-down, bottom-up approach that meets ideally in the middle, where all elements or every level of the organization sees the importance of sustainability. And really, since establishing that approach, the word sustainability or sustainable has now worked its way into our corporate mission, which is now to provide affordable, reliable, and sustainable resources, where that word was absent just 5 or 6 years ago. And I think when you get to that point, suddenly other groups are more responsive to your requests, and they actually begin to seek out your input about different opportunities to be even more sustainable in the organization.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Marc. Boudewijn, what about you?
Well, Marc is right, of course. And you can look at it. The way I look at it is, in a way, you could argue ESG is one of those challenges that forces an organization to maybe think a little bit outside of its comfort zone, right? We have business as usual. We've done business for a decade or a century, and we know how to do this. This is kind of a bit of a challenge. So it kind of triggers a bit of innovative thinking, maybe. And it might therefore push the organization to do things slightly differently, and maybe even in ways that it would not have thought possible otherwise. A little bit like at the extreme, like the pandemic, right? The pandemic forced us to think differently and to act differently, and all of a sudden things become possible, which 2 years ago we might have said, nah, that's not going to work. Well, now it does. And I think in that regard, ESG played well And especially as Marc was saying, if it gets to the point where it's really embraced by the organization and it's part of the strategic objectives, then it kind of starts pushing us to think a bit differently possibly and do things a bit differently. Now, from an operational point of view, I think, we're back to the usual, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So, you have to have metrics in place and you have to have objectives in place that you can really kind of aim for. And the big opportunity there, I think, is to really kind of trigger or accelerate, depending on where you are, the adoption of more rigorous decision-making processes, right? Because it is going to be about decisions that line up with what ESG needs or wants. And in particular, I think what it means is that you have to kind of start developing and implementing a value framework. Marc mentioned frameworks, and I think the way we would look at it is really it's a great opportunity to start thinking about what is the value framework that I'm going to use for my decision making in the organization.
Awesome, thank you so much. Just a quick reminder to the audience, who are who are tuning in today. Got to get over myself. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. Would love to be able to address them as we go along. Moving on, we've got, okay, so we've talked about the definitions and how it's really important to have a clear set of expectations for how your organization is going to approach. We've talked about, actually implementing within the organization, but quantifying the values for organizations can be really tricky around ESG goals. So how do you align internal goals and abstract concepts like sustainability in a way that's repeatable and measurable? Boudewijn.
All right, this is another one of those where I think I'm going to cheat and bring up a little diagram.
Go for it.
Because again, a picture can help us with 1,000 words here, hopefully. So I just mentioned value frameworks, and I think it's very much tied into that. What you're really saying, I think, is you have your strategic objectives at the corporate level, and this little fictional example I have here, I have my 5 big strategic objectives at the top there. And for every one of those,
I can't see your screen.
Oh, you cannot? Hold on, let me push an extra button. Maybe this does it.
There we go.
All right, sorry, I was one button short or one click short of the end result there. So as I was saying, 5 strategic objectives at the top of the screen here. And for every one of them, you're going to start developing metrics on, trying to quantify, like, am I actually contributing, for instance, to reliable service? You can flip this on its head and say, okay, well, if I am putting a project forward that I'd like to do, the question is, which one out of this whole menu on screen here, which elements or which metrics am I contributing to by doing this particular project? And of course, therefore, if you have your ESG targets as part of your strategic objectives and consequently as part of your metrics, then they will show up in your project justification. So an example would be, a fictional project which hits 5 different objectives here, or 5 different metrics and different objectives. Here they are, right? So I'm improving the grid stability, I'm improving business continuity, I'm delivering some cost savings by doing this particular project, I'm reducing our total carbon cost, and I'm improving employee wellness. This is, of course, totally fictional. As an organization, I can start applying weights to these different metrics. And by summing this up, essentially this gives me the value of this particular project that I just kind of put forward. And of course, that value might change over time, depending on how things evolve. So what we're starting to see is more and more organizations building frameworks like this and then applying them across the board. So, you really have to do it across the board, of course. So you can really start comparing apples with pears with elephants by putting them on a common scale and by having, a pretty robust value framework and, of course, weights attached to them so that you actually have a common scale that allows you to rank stuff and possibly then to go into optimization, etc. So this is really the way that we see it being operationalized, is to really kind of come up with, moving from abstract concept to something very tangible and very measurable as far as defining the value of every project.
Great, thank you so much. What does applying these concepts in action look like, though? Marc?
Well, I'll touch upon really the value framework that Boudewijn just set up, because like he said a minute ago, he is also right, and I think that is an important consideration, particularly given think some perceptions potentially internally that sustainability is just about spending money. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second. But beyond that, I also think it's about creating the back-end systems and providing appropriate tools like the value framework to track progress, really determine trade-offs, and make wise spending decisions. And so specifically, one of the areas I'm thinking about is data, and creating a data governance process to create that internal uniformity and alignment. And I think that's really important. As Boudewijn also just said, I was actually going to touch upon this too. We're all familiar with the aphorism that to be able to, you have to measure something to be able to manage it. And I would argue that that's extremely important with demonstrating progress towards sustainability goals. One of the criticisms that I've heard of the field in general in the past is that sustainability is soft. It's a soft discipline, and it lacks rigor. I don't think that's true. I just think that there's a surface misunderstanding here. It's certainly hard to take, and it takes time to build an effective data governance structure from scratch, but you need a structure that allows you to determine your baseline starting values so that you can appropriately measure your progress and report out goal achievement when you are there. And it has to be a process that isn't just repeatable and measurable, but also one that is verifiable and auditable for the sake of public transparency. And that is paramount as far as I'm concerned. I think we'll talk a little bit later about greenwashing, but that's really the only way I think that organizations can protect themselves against that notion. Is you've got to put the data out there, and you've got to be able to demonstrate that it's been valid, and you can audit it and verify it. Boudewijn did touch upon the value framework. Certainly, that element in terms of assessing the financial considerations of sustainability is important when you want to justify what you're actually doing. Sustainability done right isn't just about spending money. And I've heard that criticism as well, that sustainability is just out to address all the problems of the world and you're going to spend money. No, it's really about becoming more efficient and realizing savings where possible. And in order to do that, you need something more than you need something that's deeper than a superficial understanding of what those spending decisions mean. And we've got to really develop that, I think, that common baseline to start to do that with any sort of trade-off. And one example I will give just real quickly, one of our sustainability goals has been to completely electrify our sedan fleet of about 200 sedans. So there are a lot of questions internally. What does that mean? Electric vehicles right now cost more than internal combustion engine vehicles. So again, it kind of reinforced this sense that maybe we were just going to go spend our way toward these goals. But you've got to get beneath that surface level to really understand that, yes, while they carry a higher price tag up front, the maintenance side of it is a lot less than an internal combustion engine vehicle. We can fuel it a lot cheaper through, with electricity. We aren't going to have oil changes. There's all sorts of maintenance that you don't have to perform. And you've got to be able to kind of put those on the same plane so that you can truly come forward and say that this is the right decision for an organization.
Thank you, Marc. Boudewijn, do you have anything to add?
Well, building on that, I think you're right. There is a component of, I think, Marc, what you were saying at the very end is essentially you're looking at the whole life cycle of the asset. And that is, of course, a big part of good asset management in the first place. And if you think of it, I think a lot of good asset management lines up very well with ESG. It's kind of embedded in there. A lot of the principles of good asset management, if you read ISO 55000, et cetera, are very aligned with ESG thinking. From an application point of view, from a very practical point of view, if you build on top of what we said so far, you have your value framework that essentially allows you to come up with this uniform way of valuing what to the organization and to its stakeholders a particular project or a particular action might be worth. That also means that at that point you can start kind of looking through that lens at all your potential future actions, put them in competition basically, because the assumption is the organization cannot do everything. We don't have the money and the people and the resources to do everything. So you're going to have to decide. Well, you're going to have to decide by first kind of understanding what the value, not only in dollars, but in goodness, to society at large, or whatever is to the organization, then you can start kind of ranking stuff, or even better, if you really want to do it well, you use an optimization engine, which will allow you to select what to do when in an optimal way, from a mathematical point of view. So in other words, you're really kind of getting the highest possible value out of your resources. Now, every organization is different, so this is an exercise that every organization has to do for itself. But interestingly, in dealing with many organizations across the globe, what you do wind up with as our observation is maybe 80% of what we're trying to achieve, certainly in utilities, is the same. And consequently, if you go into those utilities and ask, okay, what are you trying to maximize? What are you trying to minimize? What are the values that you're trying to push here? You wind up with a lot of common ground, which means for us that you wind up with a library of frameworks and models, which is nearly repeatable. The last 20% might need to be adjusted, depending on where you are in the world or which organization you're dealing with, but a lot of it is repeatable and transferable, which also means that, for a new organization who says, okay, I want to really start thinking about this in earnest, you can actually jumpstart them by basically giving them a menu of saying, okay, well, this is what everybody else has been doing. These are the models and the value frameworks that they've been playing with. What do you think? And chances are that a lot of it is there. So you can kind of build on top of that rather than having to start from scratch, which essentially means that the application of the concepts becomes much easier, of course, for the next utility in line.
Thank you. I think this question that just came in from Fred, kind of, maybe you've answered it a little bit, but let's answer it directly. He's asked, how do you see natural gas companies implementing SASB standards into their reports to stakeholders? I thought the standards established by SASB were those that all industries were to be utilizing in their sustainability reporting. And Boudewijn or Marc can take that.
If only would be the answer. So, the way I look at it is, yes, SASB did a phenomenal job in coming up with effectively industry-specific standards or industry-specific metrics, which is actually great because it points you in the right direction. But as far as I know, Marc might know better, SASB is purely voluntary, so it's not like anybody's forcing you to use it. And moreover, if you look into the future, I think we're going to see others come to the table with what might well become mandatory. Of course, if you look at the IFRS, is looking into making sustainability reporting mandatory as part of your annual report disclosures. And it's everybody's guess as to what exactly they're going to settle on. SASB is a good framework, but it's only one of many. So we'll see how that ends up.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the problem. It's one standard among many, and that's really the issue: is what protocol or methodology do you use? So SASB is certainly one. CDP is another one, depending on what organization you're at. TCFD. So they all have slightly different flavors to them. And again, there is no uniformity, and that's one of those areas where I think the field of sustainability hurts ourselves a little bit because. And let's be honest, I think if you really get into some of these, there's potentially, I won't say ways to cheat. And that really goes back to a lot of the greenwashing, but I think until you get, it becomes more mandatory, and it is not, right? It's public reporting is a nice thing to do. Most organizations should be doing it. The financial sector is certainly expecting it from some organizations. SRP is a bit of a different animal. So we aren't a regulated utility. And we really don't have investors. So we do have bonds that we have out. And so we do report to different entities because of that. But there is not a requirement that we do. And so, as organizations start to think about the exercise of reporting, there's a number of behind the scenes things you can do to really understand how you stack up before you decide to take that next step. I think the one area where it becomes somewhat more formalized is if an entity, for instance, goes to CDP and asks an organization that is not reporting to report. So it is still not required that if CDP approaches you that you actually report, but if you don't respond to the request, you get an F. And it's not an F as in, you're failing in what you're doing. It's F as in you failed to reply. And that's still a blemish. And so I think there's great incentive for organizations to report, but it's hard to compare apples to apples unless everybody within a certain industry agrees that they're going to follow the same protocol or the same standards.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you for the question, Fred. So what role does community engagement play in all of this? Boudewijn?
Yeah, so you could argue that per definition, ESG is a bit of a multi-stakeholder game because you're effectively taking a very broad view of what your organization has to deliver, obviously to its customers, but to the society at large, to local community, to its investors if there are investors. So you can't live in a bubble. You're part of a community, of a wider community, and you have to understand what they value and what they're expecting from you. And this, of course, logically should influence your objectives, because if you don't, it might cost you your social license to operate, right? Which would be bad and could be, kind of fatal for the organization. So the way we're starting to see it more and more is, organizations becoming proactive, and actually going out to the community and saying, okay, well, what are your values, and how do we play nicely with you? It doesn't mean to say that you have to agree with everything, but at least you should have the data. You should have the information as to what the values are that the community at large and local communities are looking for to you as an organization.
Great, thank you. Sorry for the dog. Marc, do you have anything to add?
I do, and actually, I think that's one of the great things one of the good things about COVID is we've all had an opportunity to just be ourselves, and getting the dogs and the cats in the background is always actually kind of fun. So I'll reinforce. I probably have 2 points here. I'm going to start by reinforcing what Boudewijn said. I think that really comes down to transparency, and we can sit in our echo chambers and pretend like we know what's important to the community. But the fact of the matter is all of our organizations exist because we are creatures of the community. We've heard stories, many stories about brands that have been damaged irretrievably because of certain issues in terms of being transparent and not really involving the community. So I think it is paramount to have a good understanding of what those priorities are in the community. And that was certainly the basis of a really intensive stakeholder process that we had at SRP a couple of years ago, where we had a number of different phases where we tried to involve literally every segment that we could, from a kind of an all-comers stakeholder process to hear a little bit about what was good, what were the strengths, what were the weaknesses, and what were some of the missing opportunities of our sustainability goals. We distilled that down to an advisory group that we still work with today that represents all of our customer segments. And then we even did a deeper dive where we opened up a period for public comments to really hear what the general public thinks about sustainability and SRP's role in sustainability. So if you aren't starting there, you're missing the boat from the get-go. I think the other piece of it is back to a comment that I made earlier about, that I've heard is, as an organization, given the breadth and scope of sustainability is really the way it's defined currently, are we supposed to solve all of the world's ills? No, not necessarily. However, increasingly, we've all seen what's been playing out societally here in the last few years. I think there is a very broad appetite for organizations to do more. And when you are working with your community, you can develop collaborative approaches and collaborative projects and initiatives that I think collectively lead to bigger impacts and more positive impacts in the community than we're going to make on our own. So no, we're not going to tackle every issue on our own, but if we partner together, we can start to identify ways to really improve our society. And so I think that's a really important element of this.
Thank you.
If I can add,
yeah, go for it.
It reminds me of a little example which I heard a few years back, which was really interesting. That was in the UK. And it was to do with overhead transmission lines. And of course, nobody likes overhead transmission lines. They're ugly, whatever. So the pressure was from the community, like, why don't you just dig trenches and put these things underground? And the answer was, of course we can. It's just slightly more expensive. So, where do we start? And actually, what the organization did at that point was very simple. They said, okay, well, here's the budget. We have a budget of, pick a number, 100 million. I don't know what the number was. It doesn't matter. For undergrounding lines. Now you, community, decide where to apply it. So which area of our overhead lines should we apply this to? Which of course completely turned the thing on its head, because now it was the environmental groups that had to decide amongst themselves which area was of the highest priority, which of course is very subjective. So it turned into quite the slugfest. But eventually they did agree that some particularly sensitive areas would benefit most, and that's where the money went. And it actually created also a bit of a sense of reality on the environmental group side, that this actually, it's real dollars, it's real work. I mean, it doesn't happen by magic. So, if we're part of the process, we'll start kind of thinking about this slightly and in different terms maybe than it has to happen and just make it happen.
No, really great points, both of you. Thank you. Marc, I know that you kind of touched on this, but SRP has really incorporated sustainability across the organization. And I believe in our discussion leading up to today, you had mentioned 5 core pillars that you guys have applied this to. Can you speak to that a little bit further?
Absolutely, and I think it's actually a good segue when we talk about community input. I'm gonna, like Boudewijn, I'm gonna go to the whiteboard here. I'm gonna try and share my screen here so you can actually see them. So really, what we've got is 5 pillars here that key pillars, I would argue, that are representative of who we are as an organization. As the 3rd largest public power utility in the US, carbon footprint's huge. We know that the electric utility industry is the 2nd largest emitter of CO2 in the US. Obviously that, it's had significant impacts on climate change. So this is probably, well, they're all important, but I mean, I think this is one of the most significant areas. So it's not just in the product that we provide, and we do have a goal around that, and I'll quickly flip to the goals in just a second here. But then we also have some internal operations goals around reducing our carbon footprint. So both from facilities and from our fleet. Water resiliency is also a huge one. We are located in Phoenix. I mean, I think everywhere is experiencing potential water supply issues, but it's extremely important here in the desert Southwest. And the other part of SRP that maybe folks aren't aware of is we are also the largest raw water provider in the Phoenix metropolitan area. And it's really the foundation of our business. We started as a water development, a raw water supplier back in the early 1900s, and then we spun off the power side in the 30s. Quite a unique entity, but so we got a number of different water resiliency goals that impact both our power generation and also the water conservation and the water that we are storing in advance of growth and development. So some of Arizona's water supply does come from the Colorado River, not SRP's water supply. Ours is entirely from in-state. But it's important as one of the fastest growing areas in the nation that we have long-term water supplies to support that growth and development. Third one, and Boudewijn talked a little bit about kind of the grid enablement piece earlier on in this discussion, but the customer and grid. And so what are we doing here to ensure that our customers all have the ability to incorporate or integrate different technologies? So whether it's having EVs at home, rooftop solar, demand response systems, whatever that might be, making sure that the grid, that really we have zero impediments in place to folks being able to do that. Also a number of energy efficiency programs, an electric vehicle goal in there, which is really large as well for CO2 reductions and air quality. And then we've got our supply chain and waste reduction goal, really 2 ends of the materials management spectrum. So what's coming into our organization upstream? So how are we sourcing materials more sustainably, more responsibly, having oversight or insight into where some of those materials are coming from. And then downstream, as things leave SRP, what are we doing to tighten our footprint there? So really improve our waste diversion goals, ensuring that our non-hazardous industrial solid waste is properly disposed of, et cetera. And then really the final one here is our customer, employee, and community engagement. And that's a big one in terms of getting out and ensuring that our customers know that we are also a sustainable organization, that they have an understanding of what our goals are, and that they are really supportive of what that direction is. But then internally, building it up with we've talked a little bit about aspirational goals, having a 100% employee engagement goal. I don't expect that we will ever reach that. I don't know of any demographic that's 100 that agrees at 100% on everything. But the idea here is that we want to remind ourselves that it is a core component of our business, and our employees are our best asset. And so they bring forward a lot of the solutions to help us be a more sustainable organization, and we need to unlock those opportunities and that potential a little bit more. And I'll quickly just go to this next one here, just so you can kind of see. I'm not going to touch on all of the goals. I kind of did, but you can see there's 20 goals within these 5 pillars. And right now, I'm pleased to report that after a couple of years of developing this and implementing this, we're on track for all of these goals.
That's fantastic. And I think it's a really great example of how, defining all of these things within your organization, finding a way to add value to truly operationalize what you're up to, like that's some pretty significant progress. Thank you for sharing. We did have a question come in from Leroy. Hi, Leroy. Do you think that improving effective collaboration between teams will help companies improve their understanding of social factors and metrics? Marc, if you want to take this one first, then I can pass it to Boudewijn.
Absolutely. I do. I think many organizations suffer from silos, and we don't always communicate across those silos effectively. I think one of the really positive elements of sustainability, particularly having these goals, has been the opportunity to talk to a number of different groups about the issues. And again, we talk about unlocking some of the potential. I think when you get out there, you start to have different conversations, and you find people contributing in areas that maybe you didn't think you were going to hear a lot from. And that's really elevated a lot of the conversation and a lot of the importance about a number of emerging areas that I think are becoming even more important. Again, going back to some of the societal issues, but diversity, equity, and inclusion has really become a hot topic. And internally, being able to get out and talk about it really makes that conversation a little bit more comfortable for people. And we can all start to figure out how can we contribute to SRP being really reflecting the nature of our community a little bit more in our workforce.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Boudewijn.
Absolutely. I think it ties back to the discussion we're having earlier about operationalizing. As soon as you try to operationalize it, everybody has to be on board, which also means that everybody can contribute. And I agree with Marc. Actually, it's interesting on the diversity and the real kind of quote unquote softer topics. You actually have a lot of creative ideas coming out of your organization as soon as people start feeling empowered, because they understand that this is now a strategic objective, so everybody can contribute. It really flips a lot of things on its head, and a lot of very interesting ideas, even at Copperleaf, which is a software company. So we're a relatively small team and relatively flat organization, mostly co-located before COVID. So it was a relatively easy environment. You would say silos were not that present, but even there, you actually see that there is a shift. And that there is much more contribution from across the ranks on these topics, which might not have been top of mind before.
Great, thank you so much. So we kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I think this is something that happens when you have really nebulous, very aspirational things that aren't easily quantifiable, or you can't easily add value or define the value of. But greenwashing can be very common throughout ESG goals. It's aspirational, but not really achievable, but what lessons or pitfalls can you speak to, Marc?
Yeah, speaking as a utility and going back to those goals, I think greenwashing is one of the, I think the biggest criticisms of the utilities that have come out with net zero aspirations that haven't really demonstrated maybe appropriate pathways to get there. And we were very careful when we developed our goals. Our CEO wanted us to push ourselves some, but he did not want to go right to a net zero, because the truth of the matter is we did not see a pathway there immediately by 2035. And that's because there are, I think, there's some technologies that still need to be proven. For us to get there in Arizona, we really need battery storage technology to be to really step up, I think, and become a little bit more proven. There's certainly great opportunities there for us. We're somewhat limited in the ability to bring wind into our system. And so what we developed was, I think, a really good pathway for now. Now, that doesn't mean that we aren't going to revisit it. We are. Technology, as we all know, changes quickly. There's going to be new opportunities for us to, I think, improve upon our goal. We pushed ourselves a little bit there. More we can do. I'm confident that we will do more. On the other side of it, I think there are some of the, we'll go back to the kind of that, again, the softer side of things, where I think it's absolutely okay to have an aspirational goal that maybe you think that you aren't ever going to achieve. And I'll get back to the employee engagement goal. I really don't ever think that we'll have 100% of employees engaged. If we get it, great. But the idea there, I think it's still something that is a positive angle for SRP to talk about. We want our employees to see that way. So why wouldn't we push ourselves? If we don't hit it, it really isn't going to have a meaningful detriment on who we are organizationally. It's something that we'll just continue to dig into. So I think there needs to be some balance, is really the final word I have on it. You can't push things that you know that you can't achieve, that are significant in the community, that have extremely important consequences. I think it's okay where maybe those consequences aren't quite as great.
Boudewijn.
It's a great topic, isn't it? So, greenwashing is. I'm gonna share my screen again, because I have one little image which I really like. It's a screenshot, and it's not this. Hopefully, there you go. This is I don't know if you know the organization Climate Action 100 Plus. This is an organization that basically tracks what are arguably the biggest offenders, or to flip it on its head, the organizations with the largest potential for improvement when it comes to sustainability. So you'll find in there, no surprise, a lot of mining organizations, a lot of big utilities, and some airlines, etc. And what you see on screen here is essentially the scorecard of a company that will remain anonymous. But what you see is there's one, number 6 there, capital allocation alignment is marked as not being good. And it's very typical. You see that a lot. And I think it goes straight back down to greenwashing. There's really 2 ways of looking at greenwashing in my mind. Either it's intentional, as in, you've stated a goal, but it was a cynical goal because you're never going to achieve it. It's just a marketing exercise, basically. But for many organizations, I think greenwashing is just a transition in a way, in the sense that we have these aspirational goals. The C-level of the organization is completely sold on it. It will happen. It's just that we haven't operationalized it yet. Like we're not at the stage where we can actually execute, because it takes time for the organization to adjust and to kind of digest these new targets. And that's what you see very often with this capital allocation alignment. That is basically, we have goals, but our processes are such that we're actually not spending our money and our time where in alignment with those goals yet, I think. We talked a lot about operationalization earlier. I think this is really where you start seeing the side effects of it. That is, the world might come to the conclusion that the organization is greenwashing, where actually what it's doing is just taking a bit of its time, more time than expected maybe, to actually get to the point where it can execute on everything that it has promised. Hence, the importance really of translating these ESG targets that we have into, your everyday decision-making processes, and eventually into action. So that's the way I look at it. You should actually look up Climate Action 100. It's an interesting list, and it really does show how peer pressure can work, because basically what they're doing is they're naming names, right? Like they're essentially showing you which organizations really should move the needle and how they're doing. So it's part of, you know, the soft side of reporting. This is of course not formal reporting. This is an outside view of how organizations are doing.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing that resource. I dropped just the name of that down into the chat, so that way if people have not already written it down, they have access to it. So, you know, we kind of touched about the organizational, you know, implementation, but we haven't really talked about governance. So what role does governance play in all of this, Marc?
Off the top of my head, there's probably a couple different roles that I see, major roles. And the first one I touched upon a little bit already, but that's really the authority and accountability aspect. And if you have a governance structure in place or a governance body, you know, you are, I think, de facto giving people the authority to go out and do something, because you know because they know that they have the accountability. And so we are ultimately accountability as a result of having board of directors approved goals of informing the board of how we're doing, right? So it is now a formalized process. In fact, I just had a meeting yesterday to inform our board of directors how we're performing on our 2035 sustainability goals. And so that makes the importance of it stand out a little bit more. And I think the other one is the structured approaches. And again, the example I used earlier was data governance, right? But because you can't just have individual departments running around and doing things that don't align internally. And so you've got to build up those structures so everybody knows really what the rules of engagement are as we go forward with this, right? That there is a common framework that we're all working to, that we're all trying to determine, specifically in the case of data governance, how mature we are. What systems do we need? How are we going to approve? That you're determining the appropriate data sets to use to demonstrate how you are performing. That is actually a lesson that we learned. I mean, many companies, probably your own, SRP is awash in data. And when we actually really started to build this up, I got out there and we were talking, and we found competing data sets that purported to report about the same topic. And so you've got to go through a really rigorous process and determine which one is right, which one's missing, and at the very least get to a level of comfort that this is the source that we are going to use from our starting position, and this is the one that we are going to use to verify completion of the goal.
Thank you so much. And Boudewijn, how do you feel?
Well, in a way, I think what Marc was describing is very much the way that the financial world used to work, right? right? Like, there is only one set of books in an organization, and we have to consolidate all the data to the point where we all agree that, this year's profit is X or this year's cost is Y or whatever, right? Like there is no two books, or there should be no two books. So I think what we're getting to with ESG is exactly the same. And so, governance has to get to the level where indeed we have processes, audits in place where at the end of the year, we have one set of books, which tells us exactly what we did from an ESG point of view, in the same way that we have one set of accounting books. And I think the importance of this will increase, of course, as ESG reporting start standardizing and potentially even become mandatory over time, because then, of course, you literally are going to have auditors, and you're going to have, regulatory bodies which will look over the shoulder of the auditors going like, well, I don't believe this, or, do better, or whatever it is. So I think, this is work in progress. We talked earlier about SASB, which was one route to go. My expectation is that in the next 2-3 years, this is all going to converge and is going to become much more normalized and standardized, to the point where everybody will understand that this is what you have to put forward, in the same way that today you have to put forward your accounting report at the end of the year, or your financial report at the end of the year. You'll have to put forward your ESG report.
Great, thank you. Marc, something that you mentioned that I think maybe Boudewijn can expand on is what systems you need in order to achieve these goals. Boudewijn, what role does technology have in operationalizing ESG or in achieving, ESG initiatives? And what do you think the future of ESG enabling technologies looks like?
Yeah, we've kind of touched on it a few times as we're going through this discussion. I guess at the end of the day, it has to become part of business as usual. And by extension, you could argue just from a technology point of view or from a process point of view, it's just an extra layer of objectives and consequently of metrics that you're putting in place in your organization, and that have to be considered every time that you make a decision or any time that you're doing any exploratory work into, you know, what if we should we go this way, should we go that way? So you could argue that it essentially just complicates matters because it gives you a wider set of objectives that you're trying to achieve as an organization. That might actually mean that you get to the point that your organization has to invest in technology to help you in kind of keeping track of all these objectives and making sure they're actually translated into action as you move forward. But in a way, I mean, to me, it's like, you know, very tied into the previous question. You know, most organizations will have financial systems which will allow you to report and also which will allow you to make the best decisions in line with your financial constraints. You could argue that the same is true here, except that it's not one goal. It's not like, you know, it's not like we have a budget of $1 million, try to figure it out. We have multiple objectives or constraints that we're going for. So it complicates matter. The technical word, of course, is multi-criteria decision analysis. That's what you're doing, right? Like you have plenty of criteria that you're trying to adhere to at the same time. It generally speaking means that, you know, spreadsheets start becoming a bit of a limitation to run your show. You need something maybe slightly more sophisticated to build these business cases using value frameworks, as we said earlier, to actually do proper optimization, to do proper reporting, to track. And this is an area which we love, of course, at Copperleaf. You know, we didn't start off by doing this in ESG, but it turns out that ESG has effectively underlined the importance of having good frameworks in place to do this.
Great, thank you so much. Marc, anything to add?
I think that was a great answer. I think what Boudewijn is really getting to is that notion of one books, right? Having one set of books. And really, I think, hinting at all of the different sustainability platforms that are available out there. And particularly if you want to start to really have good data governance, you know, there are many systems out there, and that forces you to go through and make sure that you do have, that you've properly identified those data sets that are going to be the one book. And then you can provide, you know, access to others in the organization, and it becomes kind of a part of an annual sort of process where folks go in and they upload it. And then you're right, it makes it a lot easier to report out. So technology definitely has a lot of, really a lot to offer in helping simplify some of this for organizations.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Well, that concludes our webinar for the day, unless you guys have any final thoughts that you'd like to share.
It was a great discussion. Thanks for organizing this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Marc?
Agreed. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everybody for tuning into this discussion on ESG and operationalizing it. We look forward to having, oh, wait, really quickly. It looks like we have, okay. So we've got 2 minutes left and we got a question coming in from Amanda. Thank you. Which is, how do you quantify the benefits for ESG reporting? Boudewijn, you want to take a stab at that one?
So there's 2 ways to understand that question: the benefits of reporting or the benefits in reporting. So I assume that we're talking about how you quantify benefits for the purpose of reporting. So this is a great question, and it ties into, very generically and very quickly, my assumption is that we're talking about monetization, in the sense that at the end of the day, in most cases, you're going to have to apply money and resources to actually achieve particular targets, which also means that even if the target that you're going for is relatively soft, like, you know, improving employee engagement, as Marc was mentioning before, for instance, you might need to apply resources to actually get there. So the question then becomes, what is it worth? You know, what is the benefit of higher employee engagement worth to the organization? And this is where these value frameworks kick in, and where we spend a lot of time trying to normalize, you know, if I improve employee engagement by 10%, how does that compare to, you know, kind of reducing our carbon emissions by, you know, 1%? Or how does that translate, or how does it compare to improving the reliability of our assets by 1%? You need to somehow kind of normalize all that so you can actually compare everything on a common scale, and consequently give everybody or every project a score that actually reflects the aggregate of all the benefits that that particular project brings to the organization.
Thank you so much. Marc, anything to add?
I'll just be brief. I think it all ties back to monetization in some form or fashion, right? So it's all about money, frankly. That's what we're in business for. But really, what it helps you do is better understand some of your organizational risk, and so you know where you really need to dig in and improve that. Because if you've got bonds out there or you've got investors, that's what they're going to be looking at.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, we are at time for today, so sorry if we didn't get to your questions, but thank you so much. Please feel free to reach out to both Boudewijn and Marc on LinkedIn and connect with them to have further conversations. And with that, you all have a really fantastic day.
Thank you very much.